later on in the executive committee, when the circumstances changed and they are free to participate and demonstrate their free will. This is one point. If a Syrian demand that the PNC will not condemn the pro-Syrian mercenaries who hit the Palestinian refugee camps in north of Lebanon.
There are 4 million Palestinians scattered throughout the Middle East. Nearly 2 million of them live here in the West Bank and Gaza under Israeli rule. These are the people who would move to the Palestinian dream of a homeland, and they're the people Yasser Arafat is counting on in his battle for control of the PLO. Ever since Israel captured the territories in 1967, many Palestinians here have remained the refugees of that war. Hundreds of thousands still live in refugee camps, where the UN provides basic rations. The world at large also pays for their education, even their health care, because disease and malnutrition are still to be found in these camps. Survival for most depends on working for Israel and joining the early morning exodus to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. The modern Israel needs the limitless supply of cheap manpower the Palestinians provide. On average, Palestinians earn half of what Israelis in the same jobs are paid. They don't have trade unions. They pay taxes for welfare services they don't receive. Most have little or no say in the running of their lives, hence the PLO's strength here.
There's 100% support. People feel that they have to have someone to speak in their names. And they have no one to speak in their names but the PLO.
In the occupied territories, the PLO means Yasser Arafat. This past weekend saw the latest display of support here for a man considered the only leader, a man born himself in Gaza. Arafat senses this support. He senses as well, though, that time is running up for him and his people. Out of desperation, Arafat has made his peace with King Hussein of Jordan. Out of desperation as well, he's about to propose a program for peace to his Palestinian parliament in Amman. To the enemies who drove him out of Tripoli this time last year, Arafat is a traitor. To most people here, he's still a hero.
جانبا أسرع أماما عاليا جانبا أسرع كويس
For the Palestinians and King Hussein, this meeting signals a decisive move, aimed ultimately at breaking the deadlock in the Middle East. 14 years ago, the king sent his men out onto the streets of Amman to crush Yasser Arafat's army and to expel the PLO. Today, the memory of that Black September was buried as the king and Arafat stood together. Now they form a united front, which can claim to speak for an overwhelming majority of Palestinians and negotiate on their behalf. For both leaders, it is a considerable risk. This summit has been called against fierce opposition from hardliners within the PLO and the Arab world, and it makes both Arafat and the king prime targets for those who believe that there can never be a peaceful solution to the Palestinian problem, never a deal with Israel. Yet in King Hussein's mind, there is now no other option. More and more, the king believes that his own survival depends on negotiating a homeland for the 1 million Palestinians who live under his rule in Jordan and who form a clear majority among his people. What the king wants, as he said in his opening address today, is an alliance with the PLO that will speak with a voice more moderate, more conciliatory than ever before. For his part, Yasser Arafat agrees that peace is now the only road to take. After his military defeat in Lebanon 2 years ago, and the humiliation he suffered at the hands of his enemies in Tripoli last year, Arafat quite simply has nowhere else to go. The PLO leader, though, is too clever a politician to make any dramatic new policy moves at this stage that might divide his own ranks.
While it's no doubt true that the delegates were glad to see and hear the representative from India, it's also true that the leadership would have preferred to see a Soviet representative, or perhaps a socialist member of parliament from Western Europe, on the podium. But the leadership of the PLO were glad that they at least got the necessary quorum to hold the meeting. Arafat's pleasure that anybody at all was here was obvious. But the lack of a Soviet delegation was bound to give comfort to the pro-Syrian factions of the PLO, who allege that Arafat has no right to convene a meeting of the National Council without enacting reforms in the leadership. Abu Ayyad, the organization's military leader, refused to be drawn on the possibility of a Soviet boycott, saying only that he didn't know of one. And Abu Jihad, the man who most observers expect to replace Arafat when he finally stands down, was also somewhat uninformative on the Soviet absence. Like many of the world's politicians, he prefers to employ political rhetoric when faced with a question that he'd rather not answer. When pressed on the seeming contradiction between King Hussein's call for a united PLO Jordan front to talk peace with the Israelis and Arafat's broad hints that an escalation might be called for, Jihad answered in generalizations. He told reporters that armed struggle was a vital part of the fight for liberation. And Hussein's speech? Well, that could only be discussed by the Executive Committee, and that won't be elected until the 3rd of December.
Always are trying in their struggle to send their voice to the world.
The PNC delegates knew that the day had been reserved for infighting. Arafat might have won the battle to hold the meeting on his terms, but the pro-Syrian factions still had their nominees more than ready to push the position of Khalid Fahum. He had been the Speaker of the Palestinian Parliament in exile, a prestigious and influential post. The stage management of the Arafat faction was superb. The supporters of Fahum were allowed to talk, at length if they wished, but the absence of the man in question spoke for itself, and Arafat made clear his intention of replacing him. In theory, Arafat should be a spent force. In 1970, he was militarily defeated by his now host, King Hussein. In 1982, his forces were crushed in the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Then faction fighting in Tripoli saw his backers humiliated by more militant guerrillas. But through it all, Arafat remains the consummate politician. And he still looks and sounds as though he might be around for a long time yet.
فهو سيد نفسه وليس